In the winter of 1944, Europe was engulfed in fire and smoke. In the east, the Soviet Red Army had crossed the Vistula River, only a few hundred kilometers from Berlin. In the west, after the successful Normandy landings, the Allied forces had advanced deep into France, liberated Paris in August, and were now pressing against the German border. Under such circumstances, any rational leader would have realized the war was lost. But Adolf Hitler was not such a man. He believed that with one bold, powerful counterattack, Germany could still reverse its fate. From that belief was born Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Third Reich's greatest, most reckless, and final gamble. In Hitler's mind, this plan was more than a battle. It was a reenactment of the miracle of Blitzkrieg in 1940, when German forces sliced through the Ardennes, crushed France, and drove the British to Dunkirk in mere weeks. He believed history could repeat itself. A surprise breakthrough through the same forest might once again paralyze the Allies. The strategic objective was the capture of Antwerp, the Allies' main supply hub in Western Europe. If Antwerp fell, the British and American forces in the north would be cut off from the French and Americans in the south, shattering the Allied front. Hitler hoped this would force Britain and the U.S. to negotiate and withdraw from the war, allowing Germany to focus all remaining strength against the Soviets in the east. But the plan rested on a chain of delusions. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer the war machine of 1940. After the defeat in Normandy, Germany had lost hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, and nearly all air superiority. Logistics were crippled, fuel was scarce, and reserves were filled with hastily gathered students, militia, and lightly wounded veterans. Yet Hitler believed that willpower could replace resources, spirit could overcome shortages, and victory required only a shock strong enough to break the enemy's morale. On September 16, 1944, Hitler summoned his key generals to Rastenburg headquarters. While the staff officers worried about the Eastern Front, he abruptly announced a massive counteroffensive in the West. The plan was so secret that even some army group commanders were kept uninformed. Only a handful, Jodl, Keitel, and Rundstedt, knew the full scope. The operation was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, intended to deceive Allied intelligence into thinking Germany was on the defensive. In reality, it was the largest German offensive since Stalingrad. 3 army groups would participate. In the north, SS General Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, composed of elite divisions such as Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend, would spearhead the main assault. In the center, General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, a skilled and pragmatic commander, was tasked with breaking through the American lines in the Ardennes to open the road toward the Meuse River. In the south, General Brandenberger's 7th Army would protect the left flank. All forces were moved in secrecy, hidden in forests, preparing to strike under harsh winter weather, conditions Hitler considered an ally because they would ground the American air forces. On paper, Hitler's plan resembled a flawless strategic gambit, a sudden blow at the enemy's weakest point. In reality, it was riddled with contradictions. To reach Antwerp, German forces would have to traverse over 150 kilometers of mountainous terrain, cross multiple rivers, bridges, and towns, with enough fuel for only half the journey. German intelligence had little accurate data on U.S. positions, and the plan assumed the enemy would panic and flee, as the French had in 1940. The extreme secrecy left commanders with no time to prepare logistics, reconnaissance, or coordination. Rundstedt and Model, the senior commanders in the West, recognized the fatal flaws. They repeatedly urged Hitler to scale back the operation into limited counterattacks, meant to wear down the Americans rather than drive to Antwerp. Hitler rejected them all. Victory or nothing, he declared. I don't want a small attack. I want a blow that will make the enemy collapse. The statement revealed his absolutist mindset. By late 1944, he no longer believed in half measures, only in miracles. Despite the delusion at its core, the German military executed the plan with astonishing precision. Under total secrecy, hundreds of convoys, artillery pieces, and tanks moved by night, with license plates covered and all radio contact forbidden. The 88mm guns were positioned. SS, Fallschirmjäger, and Volksgrenadier units gathered silently in the forests. Hitler even created Kampfgruppe Peiper, English-speaking soldiers dressed in U.S. uniforms, ordered to infiltrate Allied lines for sabotage and confusion. A desperate yet daring move reflecting Germany's hopelessness. On the eve of the assault, heavy snow blanketed the Ardennes. Young German soldiers, many only 18 or 19 years old, waited in frozen foxholes, rifles in hand, told that this would be the final blow to end the war, that victory at Antwerp would bring peace. In truth, most had no idea they were marching into a battle they could not win. In his Berlin bunker, Hitler still believed fate was with Germany. He told Jodl, "The Americans are merchants. They cannot stand heavy losses. One strong strike and they will crumble." It was a grave miscalculation, underestimating America's resilience and industrial might. Yet in desperation, reason gave way to illusion. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the skies over the Ardennes thundered as more than 1,600 German guns opened fire. The barrage shattered the fog and lit the valleys ablaze. Within minutes, the American front was engulfed in fire as thousands of German troops surged forward, launching the Third Reich's last great counteroffensive. It was not only the beginning of the largest battle the U.S. would fight in World War II, but also the death knell of Hitler's final illusion that sheer will could defy destiny when reality had already turned against him.
Dawn broke on December 16, 1944, over what seemed like a peaceful winter landscape in the Ardennes. Snow-covered forests, narrow mountain roads, and the quiet little villages of Belgium and Luxembourg all appeared to be still in hibernation. But within minutes, that calm was shattered by the thunder of over 1,600 German artillery guns. Shells rained down on American positions, shaking the ground, cutting communication lines, and destroying bridges, roads, and telephone networks. The Americans were completely taken by surprise. No one expected that, in the depths of winter, when harsh weather made large-scale operations nearly impossible, Nazi Germany could still launch an attack of such magnitude. In the first few hours, the tactical advantage belonged entirely to the Germans. The spearhead units of the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Teufel, advanced swiftly across the Our River, piercing the thin defensive line of the U.S. 8th Army. Von Teufel, a practical and subtle commander, understood that the success of the operation depended on speed. He applied the tactic of aufrollen, rolling up the enemy's flanks with deep thrusts while avoiding costly assaults on strong points. His 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division, supported by artillery and mechanized infantry, moved silently through fog and snow, striking suddenly at areas the Americans believed were completely safe. In small towns like Losheim, Blyoff, and Clairvaux, U.S. units were driven back in panic. Most of the troops there were inexperienced replacements, newly arrived in Europe, and unfamiliar with combat. They lacked heavy armor, had little artillery support, and no experience dealing with a mechanized assault. Early reports to headquarters were fragmented. Many units had lost all communication. To them, the Ardennes was a quiet sector, a rest front, where soldiers were rotated to recover after the Normandy campaign. So when German tanks appeared on the roads, some thought it was an American training exercise. Farther north, SS General Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, made up of the Waffen-SS's most elite divisions, also achieved an early breakthrough. Joachim Peiper's Leibstandart Adolf Hitler Panzer Division led the advance, quickly capturing Stavelot and Bullingen. With 117 tanks, including many Tiger IIs, Peiper was assigned the boldest mission to reach the Meuse River within 48 hours and cut the Allied front in two. The SS troops advanced with terrifying speed and brutality. Along the way, they captured large numbers of American prisoners, as well as supply trucks and precious fuel, worth more than gold to the German army. The key to Germany's initial success lay in total tactical surprise. For months, Allied intelligence believed the Wehrmacht no longer capable of mounting a major offensive. Fog and overcast skies blinded reconnaissance aircraft, while Hitler's strict radio silence rendered British codebreakers, who once cracked the Enigma cipher, completely blind. Allied overconfidence after Normandy made things worse. They thought the war was nearly won. Eisenhower even authorized Christmas leave for many troops. For the Germans, bad weather became an ally. The thick snow clouds grounded the American Air Force, the Allies' greatest advantage. Without reconnaissance, close air support, or road interdiction bombing, German forces moved freely for the first 3 days. Panzer columns jammed the narrow mountain roads, their headlights dimmed under green filters to avoid detection. Under the falling snow, thousands of German soldiers, many only 17 or 18 years old, marched forward with blind faith that victory lay ahead. The opening days of the offensive triggered one of the worst panics among American forces since the start of the war in Europe. Defensive lines crumbled in several sectors. In the south, Panzer-Lehr Division pushed past Bastogne, while German infantry seized key high ground overlooking the Our River. Thousands of Americans were captured. Ammunition, fuel depots, and trucks fell into German hands. German troops used captured U.S. vehicles, wore American uniforms, and even flew American flags to deceive their enemies, causing chaos across the front. Rumors spread that German agents dressed as GIs were everywhere, leading jittery checkpoints to open fire on their own men. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler gleefully received the first reports. He was convinced the Ardennes miracle was unfolding. He said, "We have done it again, just like in 1940. His excitement silenced all dissent. When Rundstedt and Model warned that progress was slowing due to congestion and fuel shortages, Hitler accused them of lacking faith in victory. To him, the problem was not logistics or terrain, it was morale. Yet even as German troops pressed forward, the first signs of failure emerged. The dense Ardennes terrain, once an advantage, now became a curse. Narrow roads forced panzer columns to stretch for dozens of kilometers, unable to deploy effectively. A single destroyed or broken down vehicle could halt an entire column for hours. Infantry trudged through waist-deep snow, exhausted and freezing. Fuel was critically short. Many units had only half the supplies needed. The plan relied on capturing Allied fuel dumps, a reckless assumption only Hitler could believe. At Bastogne, a small crossroads town, the U.S. 101st Airborne Division and armored units mounted a stubborn defense. Bastogne became a nail driven into the center of the German advance, preventing the SS and Wehrmacht flanks from linking up. Manteuffel understood its strategic importance, but every attempt to capture the town met fierce resistance. The Americans, though surrounded, held firm. It was the first turning point, the moment the German breakthrough began to lose momentum. Yet even as German troops pressed forward, the opening days of the offensive seemed more successful than anyone had imagined. By December 19th, the Bulge on the frontline map had pushed nearly 100 kilometers deep into Belgium. German spearheads approached the Meuse River, threatening to split the Allied armies in two. In Washington, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall admitted, "This is the most serious situation since we landed in Europe." In the Western press, it was called Hitler's Christmas Offensive. But behind those seemingly unstoppable advances, the German war machine was already faltering. The deeper they pushed, the longer their supply lines stretched, while reconnaissance grew increasingly blind. German units fought across terrain poorly mapped, without real-time intelligence. And when the skies began to clear, Hitler's worst fear, the true power of the Allies, was about to return. Yet in those first fleeting days of December 1944, the Germans still believed they were on the brink of victory, a victory that would never come, but for a brief moment made all Europe tremble.
By the fourth day of the Ardennes offensive, the initial rave of the German assault, so full of momentum and confidence, began to crash against the first immovable obstacles, both literal and figurative. The harsh terrain of the Ardennes, brutal winter weather, and above all the stubborn resistance of American units gradually sapped Hitler's breakthrough. What had looked on maps like straight arrows toward Antwerp now turned into a maze of skirmishes, bottlenecks, and chaos. The bulge on the map was still expanding, but its driving force was fading by the hour. At the center of the front, where Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army spearheaded the attack, the advance slowed sharply. Narrow, muddy roads clogged with tanks and supply convoys stretched for miles. A single burned-out vehicle, a collapsed bridge, or an icy curve could halt the entire column. Traffic jams in the Ardennes woods became more dangerous than the enemy itself. Meanwhile, the Germans were running desperately short of fuel, a consequence of Hitler's belief that they would capture American gasoline. In reality, U.S. fuel depots had been destroyed or evacuated, forcing many German crews to abandon their tanks in the forest. In the town of Bastogne, the fierce American defense turned it into the symbol of the entire campaign. Bastogne was small, merely a crossroads of 6 roads deep in the forest, but tactically vital. Losing it would split the German advance, cutting mobility and resupply. As soon as the Germans surrounded the town, acting commander, Brig General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne ordered his men to hold at all costs. In the first days, the garrison had food and ammunition for only a few days, lacking winter clothing and medicine, yet their spirit held firm. When the Germans sent an ultimatum demanding surrender, McAuliffe's one-word reply, "nuts," became legendary. Bastogne's stand not only stalled a major German thrust, but also cracked Hitler's entire plan. Manteufel urged bypassing the town to push rapidly toward the Meuse River, but rigid orders from Berlin demanded its capture at all costs. Hitler's micromanagement, already a chronic disease of the German command, once again strangled his generals' flexibility. While elite SS and Panzerlehr units wasted time and ammunition besieging Bastogne, American forces elsewhere regrouped and erected new defensive lines. As the Wehrmacht advanced deeper, resistance stiffened. At St. Vith, another key crossroads, U.S. and British troops under Brig General Bruce Clark held out for 5 days against fierce German assaults. Clark used flexible defense, shortening lines, reforming perimeters, and keeping the road to Bastogne open. St. Vith's stand shattered the synchronized German timetable, forcing their divisions to fight separately and disorganized. In the north, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most daring spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, pushed toward the Meuse River, but their initial success turned to disaster.
Peiper's Tigers and Panthers became trapped on narrow, icy roads, with U.S. engineers demolishing bridges, laying mines, and ambushing at every turn. Each destroyed bridge became a death trap. Lacking fuel, Peiper's men abandoned dozens of tanks, continuing on foot or in captured U.S. vehicles. Then American artillery pounded the area, blocking retreat routes. During this phase came the Malmedy massacre, where Peiper's SS troops executed 84 captured U.S. POWs. Instead of terrorizing Allied troops, it enraged them. The news spread rapidly, fueling vengeance. No prisoners became an unspoken rule, and the fighting grew even more brutal. Meanwhile, as Germany's spearheads bogged down, nature itself turned against them. By December 23rd, the skies cleared. The variable Hitler could not command. American air power, grounded for a week, now roared back. Thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swept over the battlefield, strafing and bombing German convoys, severing all supply lines. Panzer columns became burning wrecks along the roads. For the first time since the offensive began, Allied air supremacy returned, and with it, Germany's last hope faded fast. Allied intelligence now grasped the full picture. General Eisenhower reacted swiftly, restructuring the front and ordering General Patton's Third Army, then facing south, to pivot 90 degrees north toward Bastogne. It was a colossal maneuver in freezing conditions, but the speed and coordination amazed even German commanders. No other army could have turned so fast, one admitted. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Montgomery in the north blocked Dietrich's SS thrust, forming a tightening pincer. In Berlin, Hitler still refused to accept defeat. He ordered the commitment of the 6th Panzer Army and demanded reinforcements from the Eastern Front, an irrational move as the Soviets were preparing their own massive offensive. Both Rundstedt and Model knew the operation was doomed, but dared not contradict him. The Führer believes we're on the verge of victory, but in the field we're dying, Model wrote in his diary. By late December, German units in the Ardennes were exhausted. Fuel gone, ammunition low, manpower drained. Crews siphoned gasoline from trucks to feed tanks, scavenged tires from burned vehicles, and left thousands of wounded behind in the snow. The glittering vision of Operation Wacht am Rhein had disintegrated into a chaotic retreat. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army broke the siege of Bastogne, resupplying the 101st Airborne. American soldiers raised the stars and stripes over the blood-stained snow, a signal that the German offensive was finished. Bastogne became not only a symbol of defiance, but also the grave of Hitler's last hope in the West. As 1944 drew to a close, the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's Christmas gamble, had lost all momentum. The remaining German forces fought only to withdraw in order. For the soldiers, victory no longer meant taking Antwerp. It meant surviving the winter. One veteran panzer trooper later wrote, "We set out as conquerors, but returned as ghosts among the snow."
As the pale winter sun shone weakly over the snow-covered Ardennes, Nazi Germany's grand offensive had entered its dying phase. What had begun as Hitler's dream of resurrecting the Reich was now dissolving into a frozen sea of wrecked steel and shattered men. By the final days of December 1944, the tide had decisively turned. From the very bulge that the Germans had carved into the Allied lines, a massive counteroffensive began to push them back, inch by inch, road by road. The counterattack was spearheaded from the south by General George S. Patton's Third Army. From the first days of the battle, Patton anticipated the enemy's intentions. He sensed that the German assault was not a diversion, but a desperate gamble to split the Allied front. When Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting on December 19, Patton stunned everyone by declaring, "I can wheel my army 90 degrees and attack north within 48 hours." With a remarkably agile command structure and an immense logistical apparatus, he kept that promise almost to the hour. On December 22, Patton's spearhead began advancing through snow and bitter cold. Thousands of Sherman tanks, trucks, and supply convoys crawled along icy roads. While German forces bogged down around Bastogne, Patton's divisions drove north, cutting through Manteuffel's exhausted, fuel-starved troops. It was one of the most extraordinary maneuvers in modern warfare, a logistical masterpiece that neither Rundstedt nor Model could believe possible. As Patton neared Bastogne, he radioed McAuliffe, "Hold fast, we're coming." On December 26, tanks of the U.S. 4th Armored Division broke the siege, opening a supply corridor to the 101st Airborne. After days of bombardment and deprivation, the defenders erupted in cheers as the relief column arrived. Bastogne was free, and immediately became the pivot point of the Allied counteroffensive. From there, American forces expanded outward, striking isolated German units on every flank. With Bastogne secured, Hitler's entire plan collapsed. The vital road network needed to reach the Meuse River was now irretrievably lost. In the north, Field Marshal Montgomery's British forces also transitioned from defense to attack. Cautious but determined, Montgomery assembled a strong group, Britain's 6th Armored Division, the 53rd Welsh Infantry Division, and remnants of battered U.S. formations. He methodically built a coordinated counteroffensive aimed at crushing the remaining German thrusts between St. Vith and La Roche. By early January 1945, the twin pincers, Patton from the south and Montgomery from the north, were closing in, trapping much of the German army inside the Ardennes Bulge. Air power now became the decisive factor. As the skies cleared, thousands of B-26 Marauders, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs dominated the air, bombing every convoy, depot, bridge, and road the Germans attempted to use. The mighty Tiger and Panther tanks, Hitler's pride, were reduced to burning wrecks on the snow. One American pilot wrote in his diary, "We burnt panzer columns miles long. It wasn't combat anymore, it was slaughter." Cut off from supplies, many German units abandoned their vehicles and retreated on foot through deep snow. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the SS spearhead that had advanced the farthest, became the starkest symbol of that collapse. Trapped near Le Glaise without fuel, Peiper ordered his men to destroy all remaining tanks and heavy guns before escaping through the woods. Nearly 800 SS troops were killed or captured. Over 100 armored vehicles were lost or abandoned. The sight of hulking Tiger wrecks frozen in the snow became an icon of the death of the Ardennes dream. Eisenhower, displaying masterful coordination, turned the near disaster into an opportunity to crush Germany's last reserves. He ordered a steady tightening of the Allied ring, shrinking the bulge day by day. By mid-January 1945, Bastogne had shifted from front line to logistics hub. The roads were choked with thousands of American tanks and trucks pushing eastward. Artillery fire reached unprecedented levels. Over 200,000 shells were fired in a single day on German positions. For the Germans, the situation was hopeless. Rundstedt and Model knew it, but they struggled to maintain an orderly withdrawal to avoid total annihilation. The 5th and 6th Panzer armies, the backbone of Hitler's offensive, had been gutted, losing over half their tanks and nearly 100,000 men. Survivors staggered back across the and Rhein rivers, exhausted and frostbitten.
Many panzer divisions were reduced to skeletons. Infantrymen lacked winter boots. The wounded froze to death in the snow for lack of transport. One German officer wrote bitterly, "We are not retreating by order. We are retreating by instinct for survival." On the German home front, the Ardennes offensive, once trumpeted as a miracle counterblow, quickly became taboo. Hitler, enraged, blamed his generals for lack of faith, while Goebbels tried to spin the disaster as a temporary defensive adjustment. But among the troops, there was no illusion. This was the end. Entire units had ceased to exist, fuel reserves were gone, and the last strategic stockpiles of the Reich had been thrown into this gamble and lost. On January 25, 1945, Eisenhower officially declared the Ardennes campaign over. The Bulge that had alarmed the Allies in early December was gone, flattened completely. The Allies not only regained all lost ground, but pushed the Germans back to their original lines, inflicting twice their own losses. While U.S. casualties numbered over 80,000, the Wehrmacht suffered nearly 100,000, and most importantly, lost any capacity to launch another major offensive. The battle offered lasting strategic lessons. For Hitler, it proved that willpower and command could not replace logistics and industry. For the Allies, it reaffirmed the supremacy of organization, coordination, and mobility, the principles that would carry them deep into Germany in the months ahead. Bastogne, once a bloody battlefield, now stood as the launching point for the final drive to the Rhine. After the Ardennes, Germany had no significant reserves left. Its western defenses crumbled within months. When the Soviet Red Army unleashed the Vistula-Oder offensive in mid-January 1945, nothing could stop them. Germany's collapse was now only a matter of time. In retrospect, the Battle of the Ardennes was more than a military defeat. It was the shattering of an illusion. The illusion that sheer will could bend the laws of modern warfare. The empire that once conquered half of Europe was now reduced to a desperate defender facing inevitable ruin. As one American officer wrote in his journal after the battle, "In the snows of the Ardennes, Germany buried itself. All that remained was the short road to Berlin."
As the cold January winds swept through the Ardennes forest, the snow still bore the dark tracks of burned-out tank treads and the hulks of abandoned vehicles. The counteroffensive Wacht am Rhein, Adolf Hitler's final great gamble, was now nothing more than a brutal scar on the map of Europe. From the heights of desperate hope, Germany had plunged straight into the abyss of despair. The Ardennes was not merely a military defeat. It was a strategic, political, and ideological collapse, an end to all illusions that the Third Reich could somehow reverse the course of the war. In Hitler's mind, the campaign was not just another battle. It was a last, desperate attempt to restore the balance of power, to divide the Allies, and to force the Western powers into peace negotiations so that Germany could turn fully against the Soviets. But it was a plan built entirely on illusion. Hitler misjudged every factor, from Germany's logistical capacity and the morale of the American army to the weather and the overwhelming air superiority of the Allies. He believed that a single shocking blow would fracture the supposedly soft will of the Western politicians. The opposite happened. The Ardennes only strengthened the Allied determination to destroy Nazism at its root. The first and most fundamental mistake lay in strategy. Hitler remained trapped in the mindsets of the lightning victories of 1940,
when the Wehrmacht was still a finely tuned war machine, and Germany was not yet strangled by total war. He believed that surprise armored thrusts could recreate the miracle of blitzkrieg. But 1944 was not 1940. The United States had become an industrial superpower, capable of producing 10 times more tanks, aircraft, and munitions than Germany could dream of. Tactical brilliance, no matter how bold, could not compensate for the lack of logistics and energy, the twin foundations of modern warfare. His second great error was the delusion of time and dispersion. Hitler believed he could launch a massive offensive without immediate counterattack, but he underestimated the Allies' capacity for coordination and rapid response. Thanks to their flexible command structure and unmatched logistics, Eisenhower and Patton were able to shift entire armies within days, a feat the war-weary Wehrmacht could no longer replicate after 5 years of attrition. Before the offensive could achieve any of its strategic goals, its elite reserves had been annihilated. Another fatal flaw was Hitler's willful disregard of his generals' advice. Rundstedt and Model both understood that Germany could only adopt a defensive posture, not launch a large-scale attack. They had suggested a more limited operation, to wear down American forces and buy time, but Hitler rejected it. He demanded a decisive victory that would change the entire course of the war. His micromanagement of tactical details, from the obsession with seizing Bastogne at any cost to holding unrealistic objectives, threw the entire campaign into chaos. Talented commanders like Manteuffel and Model were forced to obey irrational orders, destroying the operational flexibility that once defined the Wehrmacht. For Germany, the consequences were catastrophic. The 5th and 6th Panzer armies, the Reich's finest formations, were gutted beyond repair. Nearly 100,000 men were lost, and hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns were destroyed or abandoned. The last strategic fuel reserves, hoarded over months, were burned up in a few weeks. After the Ardennes, Germany no longer had enough fuel to conduct any major mechanized operations. The Wehrmacht was stripped of its ability to respond strategically, and the remaining months of the war became nothing more than a prolonged, desperate retreat. The damage went far beyond the battlefield. The failure shattered what little faith the German people still had in their leadership. While Goebbels' propaganda tried to portray the Ardennes victory as a temporary success, the soldiers at the front knew the truth. They had been sent to die for a delusion. Whatever morale remained after Normandy now collapsed completely. Many mid-ranking officers, once fiercely loyal, began to question the value of their sacrifices. The desperate field messages sent back to Berlin, "No ammunition, no fuel, no men," were the most damning indictment of the Nazi command. For the Allies, the Ardennes also carried hard lessons. It was a grim reminder that the war was not yet over, and that a cornered enemy could still be deadly. The surprise cost over 80,000 American casualties, the bloodiest battle fought by U.S. forces in Europe. Yet within that trial, the American military proved its greatest strengths: adaptability, organization, and speed. Decentralized command, flexible logistics, and vast industrial capacity allowed the U.S. to turn a tactical shock into a strategic triumph. The Ardennes also exposed the true nature of modern industrial warfare.
While Germany still clung to faith in spirit and willpower, the Allies relied on production, information, and inter-service coordination. The deployment of radar, advanced communication networks, and the American time-on-target artillery system, which enabled hundreds of guns to strike a single point simultaneously, marked the triumph of science over intuition. Hitler, trapped in the mindset of a bygone era, was defeated not only by his enemies, but by the modern age itself. From a historical perspective, the Ardennes stands as the stark contrast between tactical genius and strategic vision. German commanders could win local engagements, but they could not win a war when their nation's economic and industrial foundations were already destroyed. The bravery of the panzer troops, the skill of leaders like Manteuffel and Model, none of it could save a system rotting from within. The Ardennes merely prolonged the Reich's death throes for a few weeks, not its fate. After the war, many German officers looked back on the Ardennes with a mix of bitterness and enlightenment. They realized that in the 20th century, war was no longer the art of lone military geniuses. It had become a synthesis of science, industry, and social organization. Victory no longer came from daring maneuvers, but from sustaining resources, managing information, and harnessing national energy. In that sense, the United States had become the model of modern warfare, where factories and supply lines mattered as much as trenches and artillery. For Germany, the Ardennes was the death knell. After that defeat, the Wehrmacht could only fight a passive defensive war on both fronts. 4 months later, the Red Army entered Berlin. In his underground bunker, Hitler still believed a miracle would come, but no one else did. From the snows of the Ardennes to the ruins of Berlin, there remained only one road, towards the end. Thus the Ardennes offensive stands as a mirror, reflecting the fate of the Third Reich itself. It began with audacity, burned briefly with brilliance, and collapsed under the weight of its own illusion. And its final lesson, one that transcends war, is a warning to all leaders thereafter. In the industrial age, no willpower can replace material reality. And in war, blind faith is the shortest path to destruction.